Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
After days of intense discussions and negotiations with MPs, Theresa May has told Parliament she still does not have enough support to win a third vote on her Brexit deal. But she said she would continue to try to get enough backing for it to stage a vote by the end of the week. If she fails, the UK has until April the 12th to come up with a different approach or to leave the EU without a deal. She told MPs this afternoon that now was a moment of decision, her deal, no deal, or what she called a slow Brexit. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
Ministers arriving in the most exclusive car park in Britain. Another day when the Cabinet holes up for several hours, meant to be deciding our futures, but emerge with, in the end, maybe not that much new to say.
Leader, will the Commons have more of a say on Brexit? Does the Cabinet actually agree on anything, Secretary of State?
There was a brighter mood around the place for those hoping the government can crack on.
I think we will deliver Brexit.
But there'll be no other attempt, not today, nor tomorrow.
There is still not sufficient support in the House to bring back the deal for a third meaningful vote.
And her language is shifting. No talk of leaving without a deal. But her Brexit, no Brexit, or a new one, slow Brexit.
Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. No Brexit must not happen. And a slow Brexit, which extends Article 50 beyond the 22nd of May, is not a Brexit that will bring the British people together.
But Labour and many Tories tonight will opt for this place to be given votes on lots of different versions of Brexit.
It's time for Parliament to work together and agree on a plan B. If she's brave, the Prime Minister would help facilitate for this. If not, Parliament must send a clear message in the coming days. Mr. Speaker, I hope where the government has failed, this House can and will succeed.
Remember, the Prime Minister's plan's already been chucked out twice. Can she and her exhausted team really turn this round?
People right across the United Kingdom don't think she can deliver. Prime Minister, time is up.
This is just some psychodrama in the Tory party. And every time I think that the Prime Minister does actually have duty, she totally disappoints me.
Brexiteers, some frustrated on a march through Nottinghamshire today, are more and more angry.
She has just put the final torpedo into her own deal and any real prospect of Brexit, and that her statement will represent the most shameful surrender.
The importance of this agreement to delivering Brexit and also to the unity of the United Kingdom is such that we will not be used in any scare tactics to push this through.
But there's so little faith in the Prime Minister's plan that tonight MPs will vote on a whole different range of options, including giving themselves a formal role out of this maze with an idea for so-called indicative votes, where they would indicate a preferred form of one different kind of Brexit. But after so long, with such a mess and so little resolution, no surprise some believe the resolution could be the Prime Minister going.
Mr. Gove, good morning.
Those touted to replace her one day, still urging loyalty now.
We need to make sure that we leave the European Union and we do so in an orderly fashion. I hope as many people as possible recognise that that means supporting the Prime Minister.
What's possible now may never be as many as the government needs.
So, later this evening, MPs are expected to vote on a proposal to hold a series of votes called indicative votes on possible next steps for Brexit. It remains to be seen which alternatives MPs will be asked to vote on, but the options could include another vote on Theresa May's Brexit deal, negotiating a close future relationship with the EU after Brexit where the UK keeps close economic ties, holding another referendum offering the public the chance to vote again on whether they want to leave or remain, revoking Article 50 so that we effectively cancel Brexit and remain in the EU, or leaving the EU with no deal at all. The votes would not be binding, but they may give a better idea of what Parliament may support going forward. Well, let's go back to Laura Kuensberg, who is in Westminster for us. And MPs will vote on whether to hold these indicative votes this evening. How significant could all this prove to be?
Well, Sophie, it might be an important night, as you suggest. You know, the government has been trying for a very long time now to get a compromise that took them a long time to work up with the EU through Parliament, and just not getting far enough. So there's been growing frustration from MPs, and they do have this cunning wheeze, and we expect that they will vote to give themselves a more formal role to suggest a way forward. That said, the government's very nervous about it because they don't want Parliament to formally take control of this process. And also, there is a very real possibility that even if they have a range of options, try before you buy, if you like, that none of them will actually get a majority in and of themselves. So look, we expect Parliament to say, we want to try to take control, we want to have more of a say in giving a firmer idea to the government of what might be acceptable, but it is perfectly possible that this will not give a clear route out of this mess. The results of the vote won't force the government to do anything in any case, but it is yet another day where the balance is tipping further towards MPs and Parliament and further away from Theresa May, who, remember, is in a very sticky political predicament here, who is losing support inside her own party as well as long gone from the benches opposite.
Laura Kunsberg in Westminster, thank you.
Theresa May has told Parliament she still doesn't have enough support for her troubled Brexit deal as things stand. But the Prime Minister insists that she does want to put the withdrawal deal before the Commons for a third time, infuriating many MPs. Later tonight, they will vote on taking control of the Brexit process out of Mrs May's hands. And if they succeed, they'll force a series of votes which will indicate which path they want to take. Our political correspondent Paul Brand reports on the continuing Brexit stalemate.
If you already thought Brexit had been diverted, try following the signs in Westminster today. After months of going round in circles, our MPs about to choose a new direction. This afternoon, the Prime Minister took a back seat, driven to Parliament at risk of becoming a passenger in this process.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
We now know she won't be putting her deal to Parliament again tomorrow.
It is with great regret that I have had to conclude that as things stand, there is still not sufficient support in the House to bring back the deal for a third meaningful vote.
And while the Prime Minister still wants to try later this week, she conceded that by then MPs might be staging their own votes on all kinds of alternatives.
I must confess that I am sceptical about such a process of indicative votes. When we've tried this kind of thing in the past, it's produced contradictory outcomes or no outcome at all. No government could give a blank cheque to commit to an outcome without knowing what it is. So I cannot commit the government to delivering the outcome of any votes held by this House, but I do commit to engaging constructively with this process.
In other words, she won't obey Parliament's views, but does accept its right to express them.
It's time for Parliament to work together and agree on a plan B. If she's brave, the Prime Minister would help facilitate for this. If not, Parliament must send a clear message in the coming days. Mr Speaker, I hope where the government has failed, this House can and will succeed.
First, MPs will decide tonight whether to hold the votes, which could include options like having a second referendum, agreeing a looser free trade agreement with the EU, like Canada's, staying in the customs union, or leaving without a deal at all.
It's my deal or no deal, we've been told for months on end. This is actually the first opportunity that Parliament has had to take responsibility, to show its own leadership because of the failure of the government.
Do you think there's anything that MPs will be able to agree on?
Honest answer is, I do not know, but that is not an argument for not trying.
And when the government doesn't know where it's going, even some in Cabinet argued today for MPs to decide. Privately, ministers admit their boss may be out of options and perhaps a job.
Do you think the Prime Minister will still be chairing Cabinet next week?
Yes.
Absolutely?
Yes.
Nobody calling for her to go?
No.
Not one of your Cabinet colleagues calling for her to go?
No.
But if her deal has no future, then many of his colleagues argue neither does the Prime Minister. The bloc, yet again today, her partners in the DUP.
We're part of the United Kingdom, and yet, as a result of the agreement which she cobbled together with the EU, we would have to treat the rest of the country to which we belong as a third country. Unless she remedies that, she's not getting our support.
So tonight, MPs may peruse the menu for another option. But changing lanes now may well require a new driver. Paul Brandt, ITV News, Westminster.
OK, well, let's go live now to our political editor, Robert Peston, who's in the Houses of Parliament. So, Robert, what is your reading, then, of what's been going on so far today?
Well, the most important event so far is about something that's not going to happen. The Prime Minister this morning hoped that she would be able to bring her deal back to the House of Commons tomorrow, but that was subject to reaching agreement with the Northern Ireland DUP MPs, 10 of them who prop up the government, that they would at the last vote for her deal. And those talks have gone very badly indeed, so we will not be getting that vote tomorrow. A bit better news for the Prime Minister is that there are now signals from two of her sternest critics, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson, that were the DUP to come round and support her. They would vote for her deal, and they would, I think, bring quite a number of Tory critics with them, but that still doesn't mean her deal will pass. She's somehow got to persuade a significant number of opposition Labour Party MPs. So the big event today is, of course, the debate and votes that will happen later on Parliament taking control of the Brexit process. And if, as I expect, MPs do take control of the Brexit process, that will focus minds of Brexiters in the Tory party and indeed Brexiters in the Labour Party, because they fear if they don't at some point vote for her deal, there may never be a Brexit.
OK, Robert Peston and Parliament, thank you.
MPs will vote tonight on whether Parliament should take control of Brexit. A cross-party group of backbenchers wants to hold a series of indicative votes this Wednesday in an attempt to find a majority for a Brexit compromise. The government opposes the plan, and Theresa May caused consternation in the Commons chamber when she said she would not commit the government to implementing the outcome of any vote. But she also admitted that she did not have enough support to bring back her own deal for a third try. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is with me now. Gary.
So if that amendment, the Letwin amendment as we're calling it, passes tonight, effectively backbenchers will have taken control of Wednesday, and subsequently they hope other days in the parliamentary diary to try and work out what is the most popular option for Brexit, or maybe even for stopping Brexit. And they'll be doing that over, as I say, over a period of days. What's emerged, though, and I'm not sure it was entirely clear first thing this morning, but it has emerged later into the morning, is that Theresa May is absolutely adamant that she will not be helping them facilitate, implement whatever it is that they come up with, because as far as she's concerned, most of the things that they're looking at completely breach her manifesto. And I suspect, as she also feels, would spell disaster, destruction for her government. Now, interestingly, I've been talking to a couple of cabinet ministers just this evening, and they're saying that they're not sure she's been able to hold to that line, because what she's saying, of course, is you must stick with my deal. We're going to have that meaningful vote number 3. But she didn't have the votes to do it today, or call it today for tomorrow. It doesn't look necessarily clear that she's going to be able to do it later in the week either. The DUP, let alone the hardline Tory Brexiteers who she saw at the weekend, were sounding incandescent and totally unreconciled to her deal now. So will she move? Will she eventually feel she has to lean towards MPs and what they're going to vote on later in the week if that amendment passes? It seems extraordinary. We're talking about all this so close to what was the original deadline, very, very close, of course, to the newly invented deadline, only 2 weeks from that. Here is how another extraordinary day went here.
Well done.
I know the definition of democracy. Don't think you do. Democracy.
The Prime Minister's attempts to close down arguments like these are still badly stalled. She admitted today she still hasn't got the votes to try to get her deal through the Commons, despite an effort to convert Tory critics like Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson and the former party leader Ian Duncan Smith, who joined her for talks at Chequers on Sunday. The idea that the Prime Minister might name a date for her early departure was raised in these talks, but no sign today that opinion had shifted on the Tory benches.
Does the Prime Minister understand that by taking no deal off the table at the behest of this Remainer Parliament, she has just put the final torpedo into her own deal and any real prospect of Brexit? and that her statement will represent the most shameful surrender by a British leader since Singapore in 1942.
The Prime Minister acknowledged she hadn't shifted opinion enough to try to get her deal through tomorrow.
Part-time protester, he's off to the office now.
Some Cabinet members thought this would be the moment Mrs May pivoted to the idea of Commons votes on alternative approaches to Brexit. She refused to do that, but her team expect MPs to vote these powers to themselves later tonight. The government, though, is saying it won't implement whatever MPs support. Under the plan to be voted on later tonight, MPs on Wednesday would get ballot papers on which they can vote yes or no to a whole series of propositions, softer versions of Brexit, like staying in the customs union, maybe the single market too. There could be a second referendum option, an option to revoke Article 50 or to exit with no deal.
Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. No Brexit must not happen. And a slow Brexit, which extends Article 50 beyond the 22nd of May, forces the British people to take part in European elections and gives up control of any of our borders, laws, money or trade, is not a Brexit that will bring the British people together.
She cannot both accept her deal does not have the numbers and stand in the way of finding an alternative that may have the numbers. It is ridiculous to suggest that Parliament taking control is overturning democratic institutions. It's not, Mr Speaker. It's Parliament doing its democratic job of holding government to account.
I cannot commit the government to delivering the outcome of any votes held by this House. And, honourable members, well, the Shadow Foreign Secretary shouts that's not good enough. If she just thinks about this, for a moment, just thinks about this. First of all, we don't know what the options are going to be that will be tabled. Secondly, we don't know what will be selected. But there's another point. I think it is important that no one would want to support an option which contradicted the manifesto on which they stood for election to this House. An indicative vote is exactly that, an indicative vote. I'm sure members of this House cannot expect the government simply to give a blank cheque to any vote that was that came through.
The Prime Minister recanted a bit from the tone of her TV address last week, which castigated MPs for obstructing her deal. Nothing seemed to move the critical votes she needs to pass it. This was the DUP responding to Mrs May, saying Northern Ireland wasn't ready yet for no deal.
So why hasn't appropriate preparations been made? Why do we need another 2 weeks? What's going to happen in another 2 weeks that couldn't have happened up to now? I mean, this is a fundamental lack of preparation, and the government's entirely responsible for that, if that's the case. Because this is a new argument. I have to say, Mr Speaker, this is an entirely new argument that we're hearing for the first time as to why we need extension.
And she stands here and says to me that she does not care about immigration.
No, you came to me. You came to me.
Well, Theresa May was telling the Commons no deal wouldn't happen if MPs voted against it. The EU was putting out a very different message. It published stark warnings of what was in store and insisted it wouldn't just slam the brakes on and allow another extension just because Parliament was frightened of the alternative.
Bye, Steve. Later. See you tomorrow.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, now I'm joined by the SNP leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford, who today lambasted the Prime Minister for her Brexit negotiations, saying her time was up. And if MPs' votes don't count, they may well as well just go home. Ian Blackford, Wednesday seems now to be the great crunch day.
Yeah.
All these indicative votes. What are you going for?
Well, what we want is to see a people's vote. We rely on the crisis. The Prime Minister can't get her deal through. Parliament has voted against no deal. We have to find a way out of this. Now, there is no such thing as a good Brexit in my view. And given that we know that Brexit is going to hurt, it's only right that the people are given their chance to have a say. But there is real anger in the House of Commons because we have voted against the Prime Minister's deal twice, the biggest defeat in parliamentary history. We voted against no deal twice, and the Prime Minister stood up today and said...
But what will you vote for?
Well, what we want to see is a people's vote. But if it comes down to...
Anything else? Well, I mean, nothing else? Softer Brexit?
What I did suggest to the Prime Minister last week, and I did this with other opposition parties, our clear demand is to have that people's vote. But we recognise where we are, and we will work with others to try and find a solution that is in everybody's interest.
But to be absolutely honest, what you're doing is shedding the responsibility of MPs, which is to govern this country, and hand it back to the people who are in total disarray, just as you are.
I think there is an issue of democracy, that given people voted in 2016, it is only right that people are asked to have their say as to whether they wish to go ahead with this or not. That is the right thing to do. If the push comes to shove...
Go ahead with what? With a solution that you have rejected and most other MPs have?
Well, it's up to those on the Brexiteer side to tell us what they want on that ballot paper. But John, there is a real risk that the default position that the government has adopted is that if we don't support the Prime Minister's deal, that we're looking at no deal. Now, interestingly today, the government has provided briefings on a Privy Council basis, and that means we're not allowed to talk about them, but they're sobering about what no deal might mean. And the government's previously talked about the threat to the supply of medicines, of food, and so on and so forth.
Ian Blackford, in fairness, neither are you prepared to compromise either.
No, John, I have to say, when I met the Prime Minister with other opposition leaders last week, we actually said that we were. The Scottish Government has published paper after paper where we've sought to achieve a compromise. It's the pig-headedness of this Prime Minister that something really serious is going on, because this Prime Minister, this government, apparently believes in parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary democracy. But the Prime Minister said today it doesn't matter if the Parliament votes against no deal. The Prime Minister can ignore that. That's an astonishing...
We, the people, elect you to try and get this country working and have it governed. And you seem to have failed in that, you collectively. Not saying you personally, but all you want to do is to hand it all back to the people and try and sort it out with them when actually they have no place in the Constitution as a referendum.
It is the government that's not functioning. And if I make the contrast between that and my own government in Scotland, we have a government that is delivering for the people of Scotland. It's the government that's failing, not Parliament. And it was outrageous to see the Prime Minister blame parliamentarians for her own failure last week. It's the Prime Minister that has to go. She has failed. Parliament now has to take over and fix this for her.
Ian Blackwood, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're joined now by the Conservative MP, Helen Whately, who is Vice Chair of the party. Now, Helen Whately, why are you against Oliver Letwin's vote, which is, after all, his bid is to get people to get behind a solution which Mrs May has already rejected?
So I know that it sounds appealing to give it back to Parliament and ask Parliament to solve the problem somehow. I think there's a question, though, of practicality of whether it's likely to actually work. I mean, I think, firstly, we've already effectively had a lot of we've already voted a lot of the things that will be in any list of indicative votes. So, for instance, last week there was already a vote on whether there should be a second referendum, which was defeated by a huge majority against that. And similarly, there have already been votes on things like being part of customs union. So it's not clear that doing a series of indicative votes would actually get you anywhere different. It wouldn't necessarily get you a solution. The other thing I feel very strongly is that the way our political system works is that the government comes up with an approach and takes it through Parliament, and that is really what needs to happen, and the government is then held to account on fulfilling that. So that's why I still really want the government's deal to be successful.
We are very far away from that. I mean, the Prime Minister has lost control. Endless people are now demanding her retirement or resignation. She's not going to do anything. I mean, isn't it time your party, sorted out the leadership of your party, and by implication the leadership of our government?
So I don't think changing the leader solves anything. I mean, the Prime Minister is the person who knows the most about how to go through the Brexit process. She's been leading negotiations through this, and just having a different person in her position wouldn't change the arithmetic at all anyway. You would continue to have a Parliament which has such a diversity of views about the way to solve this.
What is so extraordinary is that she has failed to get her own measure through. MPs are coalescing around some other solution, any one of three, and you don't want to even have anything to do with it. You don't even want to hear what they have to say. In fact, you don't want the votes to take place at all.
So I think the problem is, you say that MPs are coalescing around another solution. I think we're hearing MPs coalescing around the idea of having a series of votes, but it's not clear yet that there is a practical approach
to delivering Brexit, which would actually gain a majority in Parliament anyway. And I think in any event, the way our system works is the executive leads and then is held to account by the people. And if you just hand it over to Parliament, you also risk breaking that process of accountability. And I think accountability of the government's really important.
It seems something really original has to be done. You don't want to see anything original done, but I'm afraid we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the EU has said tonight that it has completed its planning for a no-deal Brexit and warned again that the scenario remains the most likely outcome. But what of our own planning for possible no-deal border delays? Today, Operation Brock began on the M20 in Kent. Part of the motorway is now reserved to allow up to 2,000 Dover-bound lorries to be parked up if there are delays at Dover. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has been to see the scheme in action and has details on the government's plans to allow importers to defer duty payments for 6 months, a plan one customs expert described as having fraud written all over it.
Britain's departure from the EU may have been delayed, but the dummy run down to Dover hasn't. This is Junction 8 of the M20, the crucial trade connection to the continent, where from today Operation Brock has kicked in. No tailbacks yet, but this 13-mile stretch stands ready to hold up to 2,000 lorries in the event of no-deal chaos.
While Brexit may have reached a standstill in Westminster, here on the ground in Kent, it's all about keeping the traffic flowing. They're pressing ahead today with their no-deal plans regardless, and a new traffic management system here designed to keep the trucks rolling on down to Dover as smoothly as possible, and for the lorries coming off the ferries at the port, waving them through with minimal checks.
We are sitting on a situation that could be described as a powder keg, but we don't know who's got the light or who's got the fuse.
Norman Kemp owns a bus company near Maidstone. In the event of no deal, he's worried his fleet will be caught up in the gridlock, especially if Operation Brock spills over to stacking lorries on other motorways.
If we get as far as the M26 being used as a lorry park, the congestion will affect the M25. If the M25 is congested, that means that London becomes congested. Then we're going to be in trouble big time, not just as a business, but as a county.
If Operation Brock is the plan to keep the wheels rolling to Dover, what about the trucks coming off the ferries full of goods imported from the EU? This 60-page document obtained by Channel 4 News, complete with complex flowcharts and diagrams, belies a very simple solution underneath: to wave the trucks through and allow EU importers to defer payment of duties or taxes until 6 months after we leave the EU, effectively putting hundreds of millions of pounds in revenue on hold.
The government defended its decision to wave the trucks through, saying the scheme was time-limited and designed to help businesses. But one senior customs official inside Dover told me the plan had fraud written all over it and said ministers were clearly prioritising flow over control. And of the 250,000 potential importers to the UK, just 50,000 had so far signed up to take advantage of the scheme.
The Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mel Stride, had agreed to an interview, but then cancelled. Instead, in a statement, he told us that under the new scheme, all tariffs would still be due and
HMRC will continue to tackle avoidance and evasion so that we have a level playing field for law-abiding UK businesses, and Border Force will continue to carry out checks as they do now.
So let's imagine the trucks roll through and Dover's a breeze. What happens once British trucks arrive on the continent? Today the EU said checks and tariffs would immediately apply to UK goods if there's no deal. And that means one thing: this motorway could very quickly go from this to something more like this.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting. Now, as Parliament behind me right now debates who's in charge, let's hear from two people who have years of experience of seeing the workings of government up close. Jonathan Powell was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff, serving in Downing Street from 1997 for a decade. And Jill Rutter is a former senior civil servant who is now at the Institute of Government. Jill Rutter, who is in charge?
It's not clear. I mean, we're going to find out tonight whether Parliament tries to take control from the government, so control some of the business, so it can organise these so-called indicative votes, probably on Wednesday. The Prime Minister has said, well, actually, she would do that anyway, but she's very unwilling to concede the principle that the government isn't in control. So it's a bit of a tussle going on at the moment. What is not clear is it's bringing us any closer to a solution.
Well, your experience is as a civil servant, but your experience is in there. What's going on?
Well, it's a mess, and it's been a mess for quite a while. This is a death rattle of a regime that is falling, and no one is in command. No government is going on. You go to any of the departments down here in Whitehall, and no one will be doing any work at all.
So, I mean, can MPs actually literally take control? Can MPs run the government?
No, of course they can't run the government. So what MPs could do is they could control the order paper for a day. That's what they're trying to do. They could say these are our views. We don't know whether the indicative votes will actually produce any sort of workable solution. There are two risks, one of which that nothing commands a majority. The other one is that something commands a majority but is actually clearly unnegotiable. So those are two big risks. But what Parliament can't do is then go and take those propositions and take them over to Brussels and say, hello EU, we're Parliament, we've come to negotiate on behalf of the UK. Only the government can negotiate with the European Commission, with the European Council. So either the government has to be prepared to be guided by Parliament, the Prime Minister was making it pretty clear today she wasn't that keen on that, or you've got to have something which triggers a change of government.
Well, now, I'm going to put you back in your old job, 10 years experience. You're in there, you have a crippled Prime Minister. What are you going to tell her?
I would tell her to resign. She's gone on far too long. It's time for her to hand over to someone else. I think the best possible outcome of this would be a government of national unity. Actually bring people together in the middle, the moderate centre, who can take control in Parliament, who can agree on an option, and then with a government of that sort, you could actually negotiate, get a delay, and get a sensible outcome.
Could that be achieved without a general election?
So it could be achieved because under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act we could have a no confidence vote. There's then 2 weeks to see whether there's an alternative government that could be formed. So somebody Jonathan approves of could emerge as a leader of that group. If that government can then win the confidence of the House 2 weeks later, then actually they could go on and govern. And so, that's really Parliament taking control, which is substituting the current government with a government, if you like, that emerges from Parliament.
But Tony Blair, for example, would never have given up control to Parliament, would he?
Well, Parliament was always in control. Parliament was in control on the vote on Iraq, for example. He had to win in Parliament. That's why it's a very odd thing for the Prime Minister to start attacking Parliament. She only is there because she has a majority in Parliament. If she starts attacking it, she'll lose that majority. And that's what we're seeing now, as she does lose control.
What about something people don't seem to talk much about, revoking Article 50?
That's clearly a possibility too. She clearly wouldn't want to do that, but if she handed over to someone like David Lidington, who could then ask for a long delay, that would be an option they could look at.
I mean, in doing that, you could say, well, let's park this. Let us now really draw up a proper way of doing this, if we really want to. Would you favour a second referendum then? That's not a constitutional...
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because it's quite difficult to revoke Article 50. There's been a European Court judgment which says we can do that unilaterally, but only if it's with the intention of staying. So there might be some challenges if we were clearly just doing it to buy ourselves a bit of time and then wrote another letter saying, can we have another 2-year period starting now? We could see that this ends up in another referendum. One of the amendments that we're not talking about today but might come if she brings back a meaningful vote is this idea that MPs agree to put her deal or maybe some other slight variant on a deal through subject to it being confirmed in a referendum. So we might see us getting into a referendum as that's the way of bringing two sides together and creating a majority.
We've just seen young people who want to go into British politics and make it work. I mean, what chance have they got given? I mean, is the thing fatally flawed? Does there have to be a public inquiry? Who knows?
Well, having been subject myself to about 7 public inquiries, I'm quite in favour of these people being subject to one too. And I think there is a case for having a proper look at how this came about, because it is the most almighty mess, the biggest mess since the Second World War. And I'm actually very gratified to know that young people still want to go into politics despite what they've seen. And goodness knows we need a new generation taking over. Have a leader of the opposition about to be 70, someone in their 60s as Prime Minister. It needs to be people in their 30s and 40s taking control of this, a new sense of optimism and a new look at the future.
But one wonders whether this issue just simply fails to fit the paradigm of this kind of party politics in the Commons.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the party system is really one of the problems here. And it's massively difficult for parties to cope with Brexit, which is an issue which splits both parties. I mean, it started as a problem in the Conservative Party, which they sort of exported, though, across. The SNP are unified, the Lib Dems are unified, but both Labour and the Conservatives find this very difficult to deal with. So I think one of the really interesting things with your young people earlier is, do they actually want to join the current set of parties, or do we need a really big shake-up there, and would that make it more appealing for them to go in and provide vehicles for them?
I'm going to have to thank you both very, very warmly for coming, Jonathan Powell and Jill Rutter, indeed. Thank you very much indeed.